Excuse me, sir. Can I have a minute of her time? I have a proposal that could change your life. The firm voice cut through the morning air as Richard Blackwell, CEO of Blackwell Enterprises, walked toward his black Tesla parked in front of the most expensive cafe in town. The 52-year-old businessman stopped abruptly, his blue eyes meeting the determined face of a 17-year-old black man. The boy's shabby clothes contrasted sharply with the $3,000 Italian suit Richard was wearing. But there was something in the teenager's gaze that made him hesitate before simply ignoring him. "Kid, I don't give money to people on the street," Richard replied, unlocking his car with a remote control. "Find a shelter or a social services program?" "I'm not asking for money," the young man replied, standing his ground. "My name is Tyler Washington, and I'm 17 years old. I'm offering you an investment opportunity that could make her company millions." Richard let out a dry laugh. In the last 20 years of building a real estate empire, he had heard all kinds of crazy proposals, but never from a homeless teenager in the middle of the street. "Investment opportunity. You probably didn't even finish high school." "I graduated at 15 with straight A's," Tyler replied calmly. "And I've spent the last 2 years studying the real estate market in the city. I know exactly where his next 10 million should be invested." Something in the absolute confidence of those words made Richard pause. The boy didn't seem to be lying or trying to pull a fast one. There was a serenity in his eyes that only exists in people who have weathered much worse storms and lived to tell the tale. "You have 30 seconds, Richard said, crossing his arms. "Impress me." Tyler pulled a crumpled but carefully folded piece of paper from his pocket. "The abandoned lot on Central Avenue, lot number 543. Everyone thinks it's lost land because of soil contamination, but I've discovered something that his advisors don't know." Richard furrowed his brow. That particular piece of land had been on her undevelopable list for 5 years. How on earth did a little girl know about it? "Go on," he muttered, genuinely curious now. "The contamination is superficial and can be removed for only $200,000 using a new technique developed by the local university. But there's one detail that no one else has discovered yet." Tyler paused dramatically, his eyes shining with an intensity that made Richard lean forward slightly. There, in that surreal moment, in front of all the passers-by watching them with curiosity, Tyler stood firm like someone guarding a secret too powerful to be revealed before the right time. If you're enjoying this story of courage and determination, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what this young man was about to reveal would transform not only his own life, but also that of one of the richest men in the city. "The subway," Tyler continued, completely ignoring the curious glances of passers-by. "The city council secretly approved the extension of the Blue Line right under that land. The station will open in 18 months, and the value of the property will increase 15-fold. Richard felt a chill run down her spine. This information was not publicly available. He himself had tried to find out about the subway expansion plans through his contacts at City Hall without success. "How did you find out about that?" "I worked as a janitor in the City Hall building for 6 months, Tyler replied calmly. "You'd be surprised what people throw away thinking no one is paying attention." For a moment, Richard found himself genuinely impressed. But then reality set in again. He was standing there on the street discussing million-dollar deals with a homeless teenager. His friends at the golf club would laugh at him for weeks if they knew. "Look, kid," Richard said, regaining his business posture. "It's interesting information, I admit. But real investments require more than hallway rumors and trash papers. I need technical reports, soil analyses, feasibility studies." "I have all that," Tyler interrupted, pulling a battered flash drive from his pocket. 6 months of research, including the original contamination documents, the university study on the new decontamination technique, and copies of the preliminary contracts from the subway construction company. Richard took the flash drive, feeling his insignificant weight between his fingers. How on earth had a kid with no resources managed to gather information that would cost thousands of dollars to obtain? "Tyler Washington," he murmured, testing the name. "Where do you live?" The young man hesitated for only a fraction of a second, but Richard caught the change. "I'm currently between addresses," Tyler replied diplomatically. "Between addresses," Richard repeated with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You mean you're living on the street?" "That doesn't invalidate my information or my business proposal," Tyler replied, keeping his tone firm. Richard put the flash drive in his inside jacket pocket, already mentally dismissing the possibility of any serious partnership. There might be useful information there, but he certainly wasn't going to share credit or profits with a homeless teenager, no matter how smart he seemed. "I'll look over her information," Richard said, unlocking his car again. "If there's anything relevant, I might consider giving her a bonus for her consulting." "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Blackwell," Tyler insisted. "I'm offering a partnership. 20% of the net profits from the project." Richard let out a genuine laugh. 20%. "Kid, you don't have any money to invest. You don't have a company. You have no credibility in the market. You want 20% of what exactly? Of the information that made this business possible? Tyler replied unflappably. Without it, you would never have discovered this opportunity. That's worth something. It's worth a bonus. Maybe a few $1,000s if the information is really good. Richard adjusted his tie, signaling that the conversation was coming to an end. But a partnership? That's a business for adults with capital and reputation, not for kids like his. Tyler finished the sentence Richard didn't have the courage to finish. During his 6 months cleaning City Hall offices, Tyler had observed dozens of men like Richard. Men who measured a man's worth by the zeros in her bank accounts and the color of her skin. Men who couldn't see intelligence when it came wrapped in worn clothes and an uncertain address. But Tyler Washington hadn't survived 2 years on the streets of one of the most expensive cities in the country by being naive. Every rejection, every look of contempt, every no disguised as a maybe only fueled something growing silently inside his mind. I have his card, Tyler said, finally pulling a crumpled business card from his pocket. I found it in the trash in Mr. Parker's office in the urban planning department. You had lunch together last week discussing this very piece of land, didn't you? Richard's blood ran cold. That lunch had been strictly confidential, an attempt to obtain privileged information through his contact at City Hall. Tyler smiled for the first time during the entire conversation, but it wasn't a childish smile. It was the smile of someone who had just shown her cards without revealing her entire hand. Call me when you decide whether you want to make money or continue losing opportunities because of prejudices that cost more than any investment. Mr. Blackwell. As Richard got into his Tesla with his mind swirling, with doubts and possibilities, Tyler remained on the sidewalk watching the car drive away. Over the past 6 months, he hadn't just gathered information about land and contracts. He had carefully studied the men behind these deals, his weaknesses, his ambitions, and above all, how her arrogance made her predictable. What Richard Blackwell didn't know yet was that their chance meeting on the street had not been a coincidence, and the flash drive in his pocket contained much more than reports on contaminated land. 3 days had passed since the encounter on the street, and Richard Blackwell couldn't get Tyler Washington out of his head. Not because of the business proposal. He had already made up his mind about that. But because of the audacity of that kid to think he could negotiate with him as an equal. Sitting in his office on the 42nd floor, Richard opened the report he had ordered on Tyler. The private investigator had been discreet but efficient. The result was there in black and white. Tyler Washington, 17 years old, orphaned since the age of 14, had lived in 4 different shelters in the last 2 years. No known family, no bank account, no permanent address. Pathetic, Richard muttered, leafing through the pages. The kid was even more desperate than he had imagined. He had probably made up half of that information just to get some spare change. But there was something strange about the report. Despite his precarious situation, Tyler had actually finished high school with exceptional grades. And according to City Hall records, he had indeed worked as a cleaning assistant for 6 months until he was fired for insubordination a week before approaching Richard. Richard picked up the phone and dialed James Parker, his contact at City Hall. Jim, I need some information. That kid who worked there as a janitor, Tyler Washington. Why did you fire him? On the other end of the line, there was a pause. Oh, him. Too smart for his own good. He kept asking questions about projects, trying to read documents that weren't his business. In the end, security caught him photographing architectural plans in my office. Photographing plans? Yeah. She said it was just academic curiosity. But you know how it is. People like him are always looking for a way to take advantage. I fired her on the spot. Richard hung up with a smile. So that was it. Tyler had stolen the information and was now trying to sell it as if it were the result of legitimate research. It was even more predictable than he had imagined. What Richard didn't know was that at that very moment, Tyler was sitting in the State University library, surrounded by stacks of books on business law and urban economics. He wasn't alone. The copies of the contracts arrived today, said Professor Elena Vasquez, an economics professor with whom Tyler had built an unusual partnership over the past 6 months. Her analysis of the economic impact of the new subway line is mathematically perfect. Tyler nodded gratefully. He had met Professor Elena during one of her nights at the library. She often stayed late grading papers, and had noticed the young man who showed up religiously every night studying alone with borrowed books. And the documents I got from City Hall, Tyler asked, authentic and devastating, Elena replied, adjusting her glasses. If Richard Blackwell really had lunch with Parker, discussing the specific piece of land using privileged information that constitutes insider trading, the fine could be as high as $50 million. Tyler had met Elena 3 months after starting work at City Hall. She was researching corruption in public tenders, and he had offered to help, initially just to have someone to talk to about his findings. Gradually, she realized that Tyler wasn't just smart. He had a rare ability to connect seemingly unrelated pieces of information. "But are you sure you want to do this?" Elena asked for the 10th time. "Blackwell isn't just rich. He has connections that can destroy her life." "Professor Elena," Tyler replied calmly, "my life was destroyed a long time ago. The difference is that now I have the tools to rebuild it." Over the past 6 months, Tyler hadn't just been gathering information about land and contracts. He had systematically studied Richard Blackwell, his businesses, her political connections, his weaknesses. He had discovered that the businessman had built his fortune through a network of insider information and bribery disguised as consulting. More importantly, he had discovered that Richard was being quietly investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission for possible market manipulation. The investigation had been stalled for months due to a lack of concrete evidence. "Are the recordings you made at City Hall legal?" Elena asked. Tyler smiled for the first time in days. "Perfectly legal." Parker didn't know that the building security system automatically records all conversations in his office. "I just redirected the recordings to a location where I could access them." What Tyler had discovered in the recordings was far more valuable than information about land. Parker had discussed dozens of confidential projects with Richard over the past 2 years, always followed by suspicious transactions involving shell companies registered in Richard's wife's name and the flash drive you gave to he. "It contains exactly what I promised, information about the land and the subway. But it also contains something he doesn't know is there." Tyler opened his laptop and showed her hidden files. "Tracking software that allows me to see everything he does with this information. Every document he opens, every person he forwards it to, every related financial transaction." Elena was silent for a moment. "Tyler, that's brilliant, but it's also extremely dangerous." "Professor, I lived on the streets for 2 years. I learned that the difference between surviving and thriving isn't in accepting what he offers you. It's in creating opportunities he doesn't even know exist." At that moment, Tyler's cell phone vibrated. A message from Richard Blackwell. "I met with her lawyers. Her information is interesting. I'm preparing an offer of $5,000 for her consulting services. Accept and we'll consider the matter closed." Tyler showed the message to Elena. $5,000, she whispered. "For information worth millions." "He's not offering $5,000 for the information," Tyler corrected her. "He's offering $5,000 for me to disappear and never bother him again. He thinks that because I'm poor and black, I'll take any crumbs and be grateful." Tyler typed a short reply. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm not interested in charity. My original offer still stands. 20% of the profits are no deal." Richard's response arrived in less than 2 minutes. "Kid, you clearly don't understand how the real world works. This is my final offer. Take it, or find another fool for her business fantasies." Elena watched Tyler read the message with an impassive expression. "What are you going to do now?" Tyler slowly closed his laptop. For months, he had studied men like Richard Blackwell. He had observed how he treated employees, partners, anyone he considered inferior. Arrogance was always his Achilles heel. "I'm going to give him exactly what he's asking for," Tyler replied. "A lesson in how the real world works." What Richard Blackwell didn't know yet was that her investigation into Tyler had triggered automatic alerts on systems the young man had carefully set up. The businessman's every move was being monitored, every phone call tracked, every financial document accessed, copied to secure servers. And in 48 hours, Richard would discover that underestimating Tyler Washington would be the most costly mistake of his career. Tyler had spent months building not just a case against Richard, but a trap so sophisticated that the businessman wouldn't realize he was walking straight into her until it was too late to escape. As he put his books away in the library that night, Tyler looked out the window at the lights of the city that had rejected her for so long. Tomorrow, he would begin the final phase of a plan that would not only transform his own life, but prove that intelligence and determination always trump privilege and prejudice, even when they come wrapped in plain clothes and an uncertain address. The next morning, Richard Blackwell woke up to an urgent call from his accountant. "Mr. Blackwell, we need to talk immediately. There's suspicious activity in your business accounts." "What kind of activity?" Richard asked, still groggy. "Someone has accessed financial information from Blackwell Enterprises in the last 72 hours. Documents showing all transactions related to the Central Avenue property have been copied to external servers." Richard's blood ran cold. Only he and his lawyers had access to that information. "That's impossible. Our systems are protected by Mr. Blackwell." The accountant's voice was tense. "The copies were made using the flash drive you plugged into his computer on Monday." Richard rushed to his office. Tyler's flash drive was still plugged into his computer. With trembling hands, he checked the activity history. Every document he had opened, every email he had sent, every financial transaction from the last 3 days was being monitored and automatically copied. Son of a Richard yanked the flash drive out, but it was too late. At that exact moment, his phone rang again. It was James Parker from City Hall, and her voice was in a panic. "Richard, have you seen the news? The Securities and Exchange Commission has announced a formal investigation against him for insider trading. He has recordings, documents, everything." "What recordings?" Richard shouted, feeling the ground collapse beneath his feet. "Her conversations. Someone turned in all the recordings of our lunches over the last 2 years. They know about the land deals, the insider information, her shell companies." Richard hung up the phone and immediately turned on the television. The morning news anchor was reporting the top story. Millionaire businessman investigated for corruption scheme involving insider information on municipal projects. The report showed photos of her Parker and documents he recognized as being from her most confidential files. How on earth had that information been leaked? His phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. "Mr. Blackwell, are you watching the news? We need to talk. Tyler, Washington." Richard immediately called the number. Tyler answered on the first ring. "You," Richard growled. "You did this." "I told you I had a proposal that could change her life," Tyler replied calmly. "You chose to interpret that as a threat when it was just an opportunity. You're a homeless 17-year-old kid. How the hell did you get—" "The same way I got all the information about the land," Tyler interrupted. "You assumed that because I'm young, black, and poor, I would automatically be ignorant or incompetent. That was his first mistake." Richard was pacing frantically around his office. "What do you want? Money? I'll wire you $1 million right now if you drop these charges." "Mr. Blackwell, I can't drop facts. You really did commit insider trading for 2 years. The recordings are real. The documents are authentic. The transactions are all registered in his name. But you can't prove it." "I already have," Tyler said simply. "Everything was handed over to the Securities and Exchange Commission last night. They've already frozen her business accounts and are preparing search and seizure warrants." At that moment, Richard heard sirens approaching the building. He ran to the window and saw 3 federal police cars pulling up in front of the building. "How did you know they were coming?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Because I called them," Tyler replied. "Oh, and Mr. Blackwell, that investigation you ordered on me. The investigator you hired works part-time for Professor Elena Vasquez at the university. She's been helping the commission for months build cases against corrupt businessmen. His name has been on the list for a long time. I just provided the missing evidence." Richard felt his legs give way. He collapsed into his office chair as he heard heavy footsteps echoing through the building's hallways. "You planned all of this," he whispered. "I plan to survive, Mr. Blackwell. I plan to study. I plan to use my intelligence to create opportunities that men like his have systematically denied me." Tyler's voice remained calm, almost gentle. "You could have made tens of millions of dollars legally with the information I offered you, but you chose to offer me $5,000 as if it were charity." "We can still make a deal," Richard pleaded, listening to the knocking on the office door. 20% like you originally wanted. 50% anything." "Mr. Blackwell, I'm no longer interested in being her partner," Tyler said. And for the first time in the conversation, there was a hint of sadness in his voice. "For 6 months, I watched how you treated employees, how you talked about people you considered inferior, how you used her wealth to buy favors and break rules. You had a chance to do the right thing with me. You chose to do the wrong thing." The office door burst open. 3 federal agents entered with arrest warrants and search warrants. "Richard Blackwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit insider trading, money laundering, and corruption of a public official," announced the lead agent, approaching with handcuffs. Richard looked down at the phone in her hands. "Tyler, please." "Mr. Blackwell," the young man's voice came calmly through the phone. "You told me that real investments require more than rumors. You were right. They require integrity, something his fortune could never buy." As the handcuffs closed around his wrists, Richard heard Tyler continue. "Oh, and about that land. Professor Elena got a loan from the university using my research as collateral. We're going to develop affordable housing for homeless young people who are trying to study. It'll be profitable and cool." The call was disconnected just as Richard was escorted out of his own office, past employees who watched him in utter shock. 3 hours later, all major television stations were broadcasting images of Richard Blackwell being led away in handcuffs from the Blackwell Enterprises building. The empire he had built in 20 years began to crumble in a matter of hours. The Securities and Exchange Commission not only froze her accounts, but uncovered a network of corruption far greater than Tyler had imagined. Parker began to turn in other government officials involved in the scheme, hoping to reduce his own sentence. Meanwhile, in the university library, Tyler hung up the phone and looked at Professor Elena, who had been listening to the entire conversation. "Do I feel bad for him?" Tyler asked, genuinely curious about his own feelings. "Should you?" Elena replied with another question. "How many families did Richard hurt over the years using insider information? How many people lost their homes because he manipulated the real estate market? Tyler nodded slowly. During months of studying Richard Blackwell, he had discovered that the businessman wasn't just an opportunist. He was a systematic predator who had built his fortune by exploiting flaws in the system and buying off people who were supposed to protect the public interest. The difference, Tyler said finally, is that I offered him a chance to profit honestly. He chose to treat her like trash and try to buy her off with crumbs. That afternoon, every news outlet in the city was covering not only Richard's arrest, but the story of a 17-year-old who had exposed a $1 million corruption scheme. Tyler had unwittingly become something of a local hero but while reporters scrambled to track him down for interviews, Tyler was focused on something much more important: the deed to the Central Avenue property, which could now be purchased for a fraction of its original value, as the investigation had revealed that the price had been artificially inflated due to Richard's manipulation. Her 2-year journey living on the streets, 6 months cleaning offices, and months studying the system that had rejected her, was finally beginning to bear fruit that even he had not dared to dream of. And the most incredible thing was that it had all started with a simple question asked on the street. Can I have a minute of his time? But the real twist in this story was yet to come. Because while Richard faced the possibility of 20 years in prison and the complete loss of his fortune, Tyler Washington was about to discover that his intelligence and determination would attract opportunities that would transform not only his own life, but the lives of hundreds of other young people like he, proving that sometimes the best revenge is not to destroy your enemy, but to build something greater than they could ever imagine. Months later, Tyler Washington stood at the groundbreaking ceremony for the Washington Vasquez Housing Center, the city's first residential complex designed specifically for homeless young people who were studying. The plot of land on Central Avenue that Richard had tried to manipulate now housed 100 small but dignified apartments, a community library, and study rooms that were open 24 hours a day. On behalf of the university and the community, it is an honor to hand over the keys to the first apartment to the young man who made all this possible, announced Professor Elena from the stage, symbolically handing the keys to Tyler. The audience gave a standing ovation. Among those present were dozens of young people who, like Tyler, had lost hope, but now had a safe place to rebuild their lives while they studied. Across town, Richard Blackwell sat in his cell in federal prison, watching the ceremony on the prison television. The judge had been relentless. 22 years in prison and total confiscation of her assets. Her husband had filed for divorce, his children weren't answering his calls, and Blackwell Enterprises had been sold to pay the fines and damages. Ironic, isn't it? Commented his cellmate, a former accountant convicted of money laundering. The kid you look down on is building an empire, and you're here counting the days. Richard didn't respond. Over the past few months, he had had plenty of time to reflect on how her arrogance and prejudices had destroyed not only her own life, but also prevented him from recognizing the extraordinary intelligence Tyler had offered freely. Meanwhile, Tyler concluded his speech. Many people told me I should accept crumbs and be grateful. I learned that when you have the courage to demand what you deserve and the intelligence to prove your worth, the world eventually listens. The television report mentioned that Tyler had been accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship, but had chosen to remain in the city to expand the housing project. Business leaders from across the country were lining up to invest in his next ideas. The difference between revenge and justice, Tyler told reporters, is that revenge destroys, but justice builds something better. Richard turned off the television and stared at the gray walls of her cell. He had offered $5,000 to a young man whose ideas were now moving millions and transforming hundreds of lives. Prejudice had cost him not only his freedom, but the opportunity to be part of something truly meaningful. Tyler's best revenge was not destroying Richard Blackwell. It was proving that intelligence, determination, and integrity always trump privilege without substance, and that sometimes, when someone tries to buy you with crumbs, the most powerful response is to build his own banquet. If this story of overcoming adversity touched you, subscribe to the channel for more.